This is Thexder 2 Firehawk. It's a game that is published by Sierra, but it was developed by the guys at Game Arts. And if the name Game Arts sounds familiar, it might be because they're the people behind games such as Sylphid, but most known for the Sega CD version, and Alicia Dragoon on the Genesis. Speaking of Alicia Dragoon, this is kind of a spiritual... Well, Alicia Dragoon was a spiritual sequel to Thexder. They both have a lot in common in the way that they control and play, and you'll see exactly what I mean once I get into the game here. And just talking about the packaging for a second, the artwork is beautiful, and one thing you might have noticed is that the text that says Firehawk is on the side, which I believe preserves the original Japanese artwork where the name Thexder was vertical. I love the bullet points here. Not necessary to have played Thexder to play Thexder 2. Well, I should hope so. And it also mentions that this game has a level of polish not frequently seen in American developed titles, which is actually true. Sierra knows what's up. Now, just some background on Thexder. You might not have heard of this game. It's not obscure, but it wasn't a big hit on consoles. It was kind of a big deal when it came out on computers like the Amiga or IBM PC in the States, because we didn't usually get Japanese home computer games. The game came out in 1985 in Japan, I believe a year before Metroid, a game that's similar. That is the first Thexder game. Came out in 85. Not this one. This one's about from 1989 or 90 or something. Now, one thing you might have noticed already is that your main weapon is a laser that auto-targets enemies. So you just have to face in the direction that the enemy is and hit the fire button. But you do have to manage the swarms of enemies well. Don't rush into a room and get surrounded. That's kind of the name of the game. Thexder tends to get hurt by landing on enemies or getting swarmed or hitting them with its head. And then these enemies I'm shooting here, these actually give you energy back. And that's vital. In this game, you collect energy tanks to beef up your maximum energy that you can collect, and then you kill these enemies to replenish your energy, which is always ticking down when you move or use your laser. And in addition to that, you can see I can turn into a jet. There's also some other weapons that you get as Thexder. In the sequel, they introduced missiles and options which you can collect, such as ones that freeze all the enemies on screen or kill all the enemies on screen or whatnot. The shield is also back, which is a way that you can trade 20 energy up front for a few seconds of protection if you think you're going to take more than 20 hits of damage. The levels are filled with secrets. I mean, there's no shortage of exploration in Thexder 2. I can't vouch for the first game as much as I didn't play it nearly as much as this one. But this game here is, in my opinion, excellent. It's very replayable. That ammo I collected a little bit ago, those are missiles. Don't conserve your missiles too much. They're vital for getting through, large numbers of enemies unscathed. And I don't believe those cost energy to use, so it's a weapon you can use without draining your batteries. Now, I think this game has a lot in common with another game that starts with a T, Turrican. They both have mechs that transform, even though Turrican's is more Metroid-inspired than, turning into a jet. Notably, they both have an instant energy drain mechanic where when you touch enemies, your battery just gets drained until you're dead. And that is very different from most console games where, the hits are discrete, where you might take a couple of hit points and then bounce back and have an invulnerability period. The name of the game in both this and both this and Turrican is to get out of danger as fast as possible if you find yourself being drained. I always thought those things looked like burgers, mecha burgers. Those give you energy back also. Oh yeah, and one other thing that it has in common with Turrican is that they both have a linear stage progression, although they both have a lot to explore inside the levels. The levels are very expansive. They scroll in multiple directions. They have lots of hidden secrets. Unlike Metroid, it's not very open worldish, but there's a lot to it anyway. And the last thing that reminds me of Turrican is the excellent soundtrack. You might notice that it's very rich for a DOS game of this era, and that's because I'm playing it back using my Roland MT32. If you don't know what that is, I'm going to explain about that a little bit later. It's really handy to have if you like games by Sierra, because they put that thing to great use. The game also supports the Sound Blaster and AdLib sound cards, but in that mode it doesn't sound nearly as good. The AdLib usage is actually pretty poor in this game in my opinion. It's very tinny. One thing I really want to point out about the Roland MT32 as opposed to the later General MIDI standard that kind of took over later is that with the MT32 you can actually design your own instruments. And what that means is that these sounds that you're hearing, a lot of them were made for these music compositions, so they blend very well with them. You're not going to get a lead where they have to pick the saxophone instrument or something because they can't find the one that they really want. And what that really means for the user or the player is that it just sounds more coherent than General MIDI often does. The game is made for a 2-button controller, and the control scheme is actually fairly clever. Pressing down turns you into a jet, pressing one button fires, pressing the other button, if you tap it, fires whatever item is selected, and holding it down brings you to the menu where you can do things like talk to this guy. Enemy patterns in this game are pretty simple, pretty predictable, but they're rigged to really mess you up. And here we go, we're flying towards the boss. And if I have one complaint about this game, I feel like the bosses are kind of choppy and uninspired. And part of that is the limitation of the engine. I'm not sure about the PC-88 home computer, but everything seems to move 8 pixels at a time. There's no smooth scrolling here and smooth sprite movement, which makes bosses like this guy with these moving parts somewhat unconvincing. Not to mention that the patterns are, they're pretty simple on the bosses as well. Fortunately, the main levels are a lot of fun, and the enemies put up a real fight there. Now, I was talking on Twitter about this game, and I learned something new. The guy from Hardcore Gaming 101 wrote me and mentioned that this game is actually, somewhat inspired by Major Havoc by way of another Japanese computer game called, I think, Theseus. And that makes sense. It's the same jumping mechanic where you hold down the fire button and you move up to some maximum, and as soon as you take your hand off the jump button, as soon as you take your hand off the jump button, you start moving down immediately. There's no inertia. The jumps aren't arced like they are in Mario Brothers. This game is very old school, but in the context of the game, it really does work well, and it's very tight controls. And here I go fighting, I believe this is the third boss. But before I fight the boss, I'm going to go get those dart missiles, that power-up that's in the bottom of the screen there. And there's a trick to that. There's a trick to a lot of things in Thexder. Man, this game is so good. The action's so intense. And it kind of blows my mind that people fawned over games such as Duke Nukem so much when they could have been playing this one instead. If you notice, I'm just going in on this guy with shields up. Those lasers he shoots are very hard to avoid. They cause a lot of damage, so get ready with the shield when you tackle this guy. Yeah, let's see how he does with some dart missiles coming at him. Yep, the screen turning red is the big explosion. It's a little primitive. It works. I have to admit, I'm capturing this video footage off of DOSBox because I couldn't capture it off my real PC, and that's why it's tearing every now and then. The actual game doesn't tear like that. The sound is coming off a real MT32 though that I have right next to me, and DOSBox is pretty well compatible with it. Yeah, the action in Firehawk just doesn't stop. Even though there's a bit of exploration in the game, you never really find yourself in a situation where you're just kind of wandering around mazes for endlessly trying to find where to go next, with no combat happening. It's all very well paced out. And, if you don't have a machine capable of running this, but you have a Genesis, check out Elysia Dragoon. It's very similar. I think it's a little bit slower paced. It's kind of a fantasy version of this. It's kind of what Heretic was to Doom. Where, Doom is the sci-fi version, and then, Heretic comes out later and it's just kind of like a fantasy skin for it. Elysia Dragoon is kind of like that with Thexder. And they're both quite good. Elysia Dragoon is a little bit more console-y, and maybe a bit more polished. Now, I want to talk about setting up this Roland MT32 a little bit. In DOSBox, it's really easy. You get a MIDI interface and you hook it up and it detects it, and that's the end of the story. On a real PC, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You can spring for an MPU 401, which is expensive, or you can use a Sound Blaster with the help of this driver called Soft MPU. And what that does is it makes the Sound Blaster compatible with the MT32. Now, I haven't tested Soft MPU with a lot of games, but I do know it works with my Sound Blaster Pro and Thexder too. One important note about the MT32 is that it's a general purpose sound device for synthesizers. And what that means is that you'll need a MIDI cable for your Sound Blaster that plugs into the joystick port to enjoy it.